Broadcasting once again from the apocalypse, coming to you here from our secluded bunker on the west bank of the Halifax River. I am Vico, Professor Scott Velasco, and today's lesson is the only thing I've ever taught that got someone punched in the face, so I caution you to be careful out there. Don't get into arguments over this, it's just not worth it. But today we are talking about digital audio, its many permutations and manifestations, and the ways in which it can reveal itself unto we humble humans. So join me while we dive into this topic today. Okay, I want to tell you about a story that I saw not too long ago, a few months ago, on Digital Music News. The headline said, Spotify is now advertising high-quality sound. Just don't tell audiophiles. And the story explained how Spotify was charging customers extra for a 320 kilobit per second file when Amazon Music HD had an 850 kilobit per second file. Now that's an obvious win for Amazon Music, but what do those numbers even mean? Well, before we dive into it, let's compare the three most popular music streaming services. So here you have it. Spotify is offering 320 kilobit per second Ogg Vorbis files, whereas Apple Music offers 256 kilobit per second AAC files, and Amazon Music HD is offering 850 kilobit per second FLAC files. So there are two variables here, right? The first is called audio data rate, and the second is digital file type. Well, they both have an impact on the sound of the file, so let's explain them. And let's start with audio data rate. Audio data rate is the number that you see when our earlier comparison represented kilobits per second. And it's calculated by multiplying the sample rate and the bit depth at which the digital audio is encoded, and then dividing that number by the audio channels. Now, you've been learning a lot about sample rate and bit depth in your DAW class, so I'm not going to belabor that point here, but suffice to say, a larger sample rate equals a wider frequency response, meaning you hear more of the original frequency content. Bit depth, however, is related to dynamic range, so a larger bit depth will mean less noise floor and more room before distortion in the signal, which equates to a clearer presentation of the original audio. So higher numbers for both sample rate and bit depth equal better digital audio quality. To an extent. Now let's talk about file types. Well, there are many types of digital audio files. Uncompressed, lossless files retain all the information between the analog to digital conversion. And examples of these would include the WAV file, which was originally developed for the Windows format, and the piece and the AIFF file, which was originally developed for Apple. The converted audio in a full fidelity file is theoretically identical between output and input. On the other hand, there are compressed lossy files, and examples of these would include MP3, which you've all probably heard of, and AAC files. So these lossy, compressed files omit information during the analog to digital conversion in order to make them smaller, and therefore they're easier to stream and easier to store. In fact, a typical MP3 only takes up 1/10 of the data storage space as a .wav file would. And during the late 90s and early 2000s, when internet audio was first becoming a big deal, storage was more expensive and streaming bandwidth was very limited. So this was a huge advantage. Now, more recently, we have come up with compressed lossless files, which, although they're a little larger than the Lossy files, are still smaller packages than full fidelity and retain almost all of the original audio quality. So digital studio recordings almost always begin as an uncompressed, lossless file, either a .bwf, .wav, or .aiff file. The modern preferred standard is .bwf because its advantage over regular WAV files is that it contains a little bit of metadata that tells you some important information about the file type, including where in the timeline it was originally recorded. However, the product that is delivered to most streaming services from the artist, record label, or mastering engineer usually goes through another conversion stage to turn it into a file type that is in some way smaller and more easily distributed through a broadband connection. The important thing to understand here is that once the file has been converted, though, any data that was lost in that conversion process is lost permanently. In other words, going from a full fidelity file to an MP3 will result in a loss of quality. But going from an MP3 back to a full fidelity file doesn't restore any of that lost quality. As my friend Dan Baird likes to say, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Now, I've got a demonstration that should make this a little bit clearer, should help you wrap your mind around this concept. So be sure to check back in for our second part of this video when I'm going to show you in Pro Tools exactly the difference between a full fidelity file and a compressed file like an MP3. Until then, it's time to bounce. This is me, Scott Velasco, fading out.